The January blizzard had already claimed 2 days when Thomas Reed saw something moving near his frozen fence line, something that shouldn't have been there, something fighting to survive against impossible odds. What he discovered in that frozen wasteland would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, motherhood, and the unbreakable will to protect those we love. Before we continue with this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments which city or country you're watching from. We have horse lovers tuning in from all corners of the globe, and we absolutely love hearing where you're from. Your support means the world to us. Thomas Reed had been farming in Wyoming for 43 years. He'd seen storms that buried tractors, winters that killed entire herds, and cold so brutal it turned diesel fuel to jelly in the tank. But he'd never seen anything like this. The blizzard had started on a Tuesday evening, innocent enough at first, just light flurries dancing in the headlights as Thomas drove home from town. By Wednesday morning, 3 feet of snow had buried his ranch, and the wind was screaming across the plains like a living thing, angry and relentless. By Thursday, the power was gone, the roads were impassable, and Thomas was alone on his ranch with his cattle, his dogs, and the growing certainty that this storm was something different, something dangerous. He'd managed to get his cattle into the barn before the worst of it hit. His border collies, Max and Belle, stayed close to the wood stove in the kitchen. But on Friday morning, as Thomas fought through waist-deep drifts to check his fence lines, he saw something that made his blood run colder than the air around him. Movement near the northern fence. At first, he thought it might be a deer or an elk driven down from the mountains by the storm. But as he pushed closer, his snowshoes breaking through the frozen crust with each step, he realized what he was looking at was much larger. A horse. A gray mare, her coat so pale she almost disappeared against the snow, and she was standing perfectly still, her head lowered, her body angled against the wind in a way that seemed almost protective. What, in God's name? Thomas breathed, his words snatched away by the wind. He'd seen wild horses before. Wyoming had small herds scattered through the mountains. But this mare didn't look wild. Her mane had been trimmed at some point, and even through the ice coating her body, Thomas could see she'd once been well fed. Someone had owned her, someone had cared for her, and someone had left her to die in this storm. Thomas pushed forward, calling out to her, but the mare didn't move, didn't even acknowledge his presence. As he got within 20 feet, he understood why. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, milky white and unseeing. She was completely blind. "Oh, sweetheart," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "How long have you been out here?" The mare's ears swiveled toward his voice, but she still didn't move from her position. There was something deliberate about her stance, something that made Thomas circle around her slowly, carefully, trying to understand what she was doing, and then he saw them. 2 tiny bodies curled against the mare's belly, sheltered from the wind by her own body. 2 newborn foals, their coats still damp, their small bodies pressed so close together they looked like a single creature. Twins. Thomas had been ranching long enough to know that twin foals were rare and dangerous. Most mares couldn't produce enough milk for 2 babies. Many twins didn't survive. And these 2 had been born in the middle of the worst blizzard Wyoming had seen in a decade, to a blind mother who had no shelter, no food, and no help. They shouldn't have been alive. By every law of nature and probability, they should have frozen within hours of birth. But they were breathing, both of them, their small sides rising and falling in perfect rhythm. And their mother, this blind, abandoned mare, had kept them alive through sheer will and the kind of love that transcends sight, transcends fear, transcends even the certainty of death. Thomas felt tears freeze on his cheeks. He'd seen a lot in his 43 years of ranching, but he'd never witnessed anything like this. This mare couldn't see her babies, couldn't see the storm, couldn't see the danger all around them. But somehow she had positioned her body perfectly to shield them from the killing wind. Somehow she had known exactly what to do. If this story is touching your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope and determination today. And don't forget to subscribe. We share incredible horse stories like this one every week. Thomas didn't remember making the decision to save them. His body just moved, driven by 43 years of ranch instincts, and something deeper, something that wouldn't let him walk away from this family fighting so hard to survive. "I'm going to help you," he told the mare, knowing she couldn't see him but hoping she could hear the intention in his voice. "All three of you, I promise." The problem was immediate and overwhelming. The barn was 300 yards away through drifts that would be impossible for newborn foals to navigate. The mare was weak. Thomas could see her legs trembling with exhaustion. She'd probably been standing in that protective stance for hours, maybe since the foals were born, using her body as a windbreak to keep them alive. Moving her might cause her to panic. Panicked, she could accidentally hurt her babies, but leaving them here meant certain death. Thomas made a choice that went against every safety instinct he'd developed over 4 decades of working with horses. He approached the mare slowly, speaking constantly, letting her track his position by sound alone. When he reached her shoulder, he placed one hand on her neck. She flinched but didn't bolt. "Good girl," Thomas murmured. "I know you're scared. I know you don't know me, but your babies need help, and I'm going to give it to you. I just need you to trust me." The mare's whole body was shaking. Whether from cold, exhaustion, or fear, Thomas couldn't tell. Probably all three. He ran his hand down her shoulder, feeling her ribs too prominent beneath her coat, and felt a surge of anger at whoever had abandoned her. You don't throw away a horse because she's blind. You don't leave a pregnant mare to die in the wilderness. Thomas had his phone in his pocket, but there was no signal this far from the house, and no way to call for help anyway. The roads were completely impassable. Even his tractor couldn't move through these drifts. He was on his own with this decision. He looked down at the foals. They were tiny, premature maybe, or just small because they were twins. Their eyes were closed, their ears folded flat against their small heads. They made small noises, almost like kittens, as they pressed against their mother's warmth. One was slightly larger, with a darker gray coat that would probably turn white as it matured. The other was pale like its mother, almost ghostly in the snow. Both had perfect white stars on their foreheads, identical markings that made Thomas's throat tight with emotion. He'd delivered hundreds of foals in his lifetime, but he'd never seen anything like this. Twin foals born in a blizzard to a blind mother who somehow, impossibly, had kept them alive. Thomas pulled off his heavy winter coat and wrapped it around both foals, bundling them together. The mare tensed at the movement, her head swinging toward where she'd last sensed her babies, a small sound of distress escaping her. "It's okay, Mama," Thomas said quickly. "I've got them. They're safe. But we need to move. You need to follow my voice." What happened next would stay with Thomas Reed for the rest of his life. The blind mare, who should have been too exhausted to move, who had every reason to panic when a stranger touched her newborn foals, made a choice. She took a step forward, toward Thomas's voice, then another. She was following him. This blind, exhausted, protective mother was choosing to trust a human she couldn't see. In a storm that must have been terrifying to navigate without sight, Thomas moved slowly, constantly talking, creating a path with his snowshoes that the mare could follow by the sound of his movement and voice. Every few steps he'd stop and let her catch up, let her lower her head to smell the bundle he carried, confirming her babies were still there. The 300-yard journey to the barn took almost an hour. Thomas's arms burned from carrying the foals. His legs screamed from breaking trail through the deep snow. The wind tried to knock him down with every gust, and the temperature was dropping as afternoon faded toward evening. But the mare never stopped following, never gave up. Step by exhausting step, she fought her way through that blinding snow, trusting a stranger's voice because it was leading her babies to safety. When they finally reached the barn, Thomas's dog started barking from inside the house, but he couldn't worry about them now. He shouldered open the barn door, thank God he'd managed to clear it that morning, and led the mare into the relative warmth and shelter. He'd prepared a large stall earlier for one of his cows who was due to calf, and now he guided the mare into it, her hooves slipping on the concrete floor before finding purchase in the deep straw he'd laid down. Only when she was safely inside did Thomas carefully lower the bundle of foals to the ground, unwrapping them from his coat. The mare immediately moved to them, her nose searching, finding each baby and inhaling deeply, checking them with a desperation that broke Thomas's heart. She made soft nickering sounds, the universal language of horse mothers everywhere, telling her babies she was there, they were safe, everything would be okay. Both foals responded, their tiny voices answering hers. Thomas stood back, giving them space, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They'd made it. All three of them. But the crisis wasn't over. The mare was severely dehydrated and malnourished. The foals needed to nurse soon, or they wouldn't survive the night. And Thomas needed to figure out where this family had come from and why they'd been abandoned. Over the next few hours, as the storm continued to rage outside, Thomas worked with a focus he hadn't felt in years. He got warm water into the mare, a little at a time so she wouldn't colic. He rubbed down all three horses with towels, getting them as dry as possible. He made sure the barn was as sealed against the wind as he could manage, and he brought in extra heat lamps. The critical moment came around midnight. The foals needed to nurse, but they were too weak to stand on their own. Thomas had to help each one to its feet, support its wobbling legs, and guide it to the mare's belly. The mare stood perfectly still through all of this, as if she understood exactly what he was trying to do. When the first foal latched on and began to nurse, Thomas heard the mare let out a long, shuddering sigh. Relief, exhaustion, and gratitude all mixed together. The second foal was more difficult, smaller and weaker. It took 3 attempts before it found the right position and began to drink. But once both babies were nursing, the sound of their contented suckling filled the quiet barn, and Thomas finally let himself believe they might actually make it. He pulled up a hay bale and sat down, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. Max and Belle had somehow gotten into the barn, probably squeezed through the gap under the house door, and they lay down at his feet, their presence comforting. Thomas watched the mare with her twins, and something shifted inside his chest. This blind horse had done what most seeing horses would struggle with. She'd given birth in a blizzard, kept her babies alive through the worst storm in a decade, and then trusted a complete stranger to lead her to safety. She couldn't see her babies' faces, couldn't see the danger she'd survived, couldn't see the man who'd saved them. But she didn't need to see any of that. She had something more powerful than sight. She had love, and love, Thomas was learning, could accomplish miracles that logic said were impossible. The storm finally broke on Saturday morning. Thomas woke up in the barn. He'd fallen asleep on that hay bale, too exhausted to make it back to the house. Sunlight was streaming through the cracks in the barn walls, turning the dust motes into floating gold. The mare was lying down with both foals curled against her belly, all 3 of them resting peacefully. When Thomas stirred, the mare's ears swiveled toward him, tracking his movement, even though she couldn't see it. "Good morning, beautiful," Thomas said softly. "You made it through the night." Now came the hard part, figuring out where she'd come from and whether anyone was looking for her. Thomas spent the morning digging out his truck and making calls. The local veterinarian couldn't get to the ranch for at least 2 more days. Too many emergencies from the storm. But she talked Thomas through checking the mare and foals over the phone, and was amazed when he described the situation. "Twin foals in a blizzard to a blind mare," Dr. Sarah Martinez said. "Thomas, that's impossible. Twin pregnancies are already high risk. Add in the mother's blindness and exposure to extreme cold, and those foals shouldn't have survived more than an hour." "Well, they did," Thomas said, looking at the family in the stall. "And the mom is the reason why." Dr. Martinez promised to come out as soon as the roads were clear. In the meantime, Thomas called the sheriff's office to report finding the horse, in case someone had filed a missing animal report. The answer he got made his blood boil. "Oh yeah," Deputy Jake Morrison said. "We got a call about 3 weeks ago from the Carson place, about 15 miles west of you. Old man Carson died back in November, and his kids were trying to sell off his livestock. They mentioned they had a blind mare they couldn't sell, said they were going to handle it themselves." "Handle it," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. Look, Thomas, I know what you're thinking, but there's no law against putting down your own livestock. It's unfortunate, but she was pregnant, Jake. With twins. And instead of putting her down humanely, they dumped her in the wilderness to die of exposure. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You got proof they dumped her? She's got a halter scar. She's been trimmed and cared for. She didn't just wander onto my property. She was driven here and abandoned. I'll look into it, Jake said, but his tone suggested he wouldn't look very hard. Thomas hung up, furious. The Carson kids had inherited their father's ranch and decided a blind mare wasn't worth the cost of a vet visit to put her down humanely. So they'd driven her out into the wilderness and left her to die slowly, not knowing or caring that she was carrying 2 babies. It was cruelty disguised as practicality, and it made Thomas sick. But there was a silver lining to the Carson connection. If they had abandoned the mare, they'd effectively surrendered ownership. And if Thomas could prove abandonment, he could claim her legally. He called his lawyer, explained the situation, and within a week had the documentation he needed. The mare and her foals were officially his. So what are you going to name them? Dr. Martinez asked, when she finally made it out to the ranch. She'd spent 2 hours examining all 3 horses and declared them remarkably healthy considering their ordeal. Thomas had been thinking about that. He'd always named his animals practical things, Brownie, Spot, Red, but these 3 deserve something more. The mama's Grace, he said, stroking the mare's neck, because that's what she showed in the storm, grace under impossible pressure. And the babies. Thomas looked at the twins, now a week old and already showing distinct personalities. The larger one was bold and curious, already trying to explore beyond the stall. The smaller one was gentler, more cautious, but with an intelligence in its eyes that reminded Thomas of Grace herself. The big one's hope, he said, because hope is what kept their mama alive, and the little one's faith, because you'd need faith to believe they could survive. Dr. Martinez smiled. Grace, hope, and faith. That's perfect, Thomas. Over the following weeks, the story of the blind mare and her miracle twins spread through the community. People started stopping by the ranch just to see them, bringing carrots and apples and their own stories of animals who'd survived against the odds. A local news station picked up the story, and suddenly Thomas was being interviewed on camera, explaining how he'd found Grace in the storm. The footage of Grace with her twins, all 3 of them healthy and thriving, went viral online. Donations started pouring in, people wanting to help with vet bills and feed costs. Thomas set up a fund for Grace and her babies, and when it exceeded what he needed, he donated the extra to a horse rescue organization that specialized in blind and disabled horses. But the most meaningful moment came 6 weeks after the rescue, when the snow had finally melted and spring was beginning to green the Wyoming plains. Thomas led Grace and her twins out to the pasture for the first time. The foals had never been outside the barn, and their reactions to open space were pure joy, bucking, kicking, racing in circles around their mother. Grace stood still for a moment, her blind eyes facing the sun, her nose lifted to catch the spring breeze. Then slowly, deliberately, she walked forward into the pasture, her babies circling back to check on her every few seconds. Thomas leaned on the fence and watched them, these 3 horses who shouldn't have survived, who had beaten every odd stacked against them. Max and Belle sat beside him, tails wagging, equally mesmerized by the sight. You know what the amazing thing is? Thomas said to his dogs, who listened with cocked heads as if they understood every word. Grace never gave up. She couldn't see the storm, couldn't see help coming, couldn't see any reason to hope. But she protected her babies anyway. She kept going anyway. She trusted anyway. He pulled out his phone and took a photo. Grace silhouetted against the morning sun, her twins playing in the grass around her, the Wyoming plains stretching to the horizon. That photo would hang in Thomas's kitchen for the rest of his life, a reminder that love doesn't need eyes to see what matters. That a mother's determination can overcome nature's cruelest tests, and that sometimes in the middle of the worst storm, the most beautiful miracles are waiting to be discovered. The Carson kids never came forward to claim Grace. They probably didn't even know she'd survived, and Thomas was content to keep it that way. As far as he was concerned, they'd given up any right to her when they'd driven her into the wilderness to die. Grace and her twins became permanent residents of the Reed Ranch. As Hope and Faith grew, they developed into stunning horses. Both inherited their mother's gray coat, though Hope's was darker and Faith's was nearly white. More importantly, they inherited Grace's temperament, calm, intelligent, and impossibly resilient. Thomas trained them gently, never forgetting that these were miracle babies who'd survived their first hours in a frozen hell. They responded to his careful handling with trust and affection that reminded him daily of why he'd become a rancher in the first place. Not for profit or efficiency, but for these moments of connection between human and animal. Grace herself thrived in her new home. Without the stress of abandonment and survival, her personality emerged, playful, affectionate, and protective of her babies, even as they grew into adults. She learned the layout of her pasture by heart, moving through it with confidence that amazed everyone who saw her. Visitors to the ranch were always surprised to learn she was blind. Only when they got close enough to see her clouded eyes did they understand the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. Thomas would tell Grace's story to anyone who asked, and many who didn't. He'd describe that moment in the blizzard when he'd first seen her standing in the snow, protecting two babies she couldn't see, refusing to give up even when giving up would have been so much easier. "That mare taught me something important," he'd say, scratching Grace behind the ears while she leaned into his touch. "She taught me that the worst storms in life don't ask our permission before they hit. They don't care if we're ready or if we're strong enough or if we can see where we're going. But we get to choose how we respond. We can give up, or we can stand our ground and protect what matters most." Grace chose to stand. And because she did, because she refused to surrender even when everything said she should, her babies got to live. That's not just survival. That's heroism. 5 years after the rescue, Thomas stood in his barn on a January morning, remembering that blizzard and the blind mare who'd changed his life. Grace was in her stall with Hope and Faith nearby, all three of them permanent fixtures of the ranch now, beloved by everyone who knew them. Grace's muzzle had gone white with age, and she moved a little slower than she used to, but her spirit was as strong as ever, and when Thomas approached her stall, she nickered a greeting, recognizing his footsteps even before he spoke. "Good morning, beautiful," Thomas said, the same words he'd spoken to her every morning for 5 years. Grace pushed her head into his chest, a gesture of affection they'd developed over their time together. Thomas wrapped his arms around her neck and rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not giving up in that storm. Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like. Thank you for reminding me why any of this matters." Grace didn't respond with words. She couldn't. But her presence said everything that needed saying. She was alive. Her babies were alive. And they were all exactly where they belonged. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again. Just light flurries, nothing like the killer storm that had brought them together. But Thomas felt a flutter of old fear, remembering that desperate race through the drifts, with 2 dying foals in his arms. Then he looked at Grace, standing calmly in her stall, unbothered by the snow she couldn't see, and the fear faded. They'd survived the worst together. Whatever came next, they'd face it the same way, with grace, with hope, with faith, and with the kind of love that doesn't need eyes to see what truly matters. Years would pass, and Grace would eventually grow old, surrounded by her children and the man who'd saved them all. Hope and Faith would have foals of their own, carrying on their mother's legacy of strength and resilience. The Reed Ranch would become known throughout Wyoming not just as a working farm, but as a place where miracles had happened, where a blind mare had proven that the most powerful force in the world isn't sight or strength or even survival instinct. It's love. Thomas would tell Grace's story hundreds of times over the years, to school children visiting the ranch, to reporters covering feel-good stories, to other ranchers who'd lost hope in hard times. And every time he told it, he'd end the same way. That mare couldn't see where she was going. She couldn't see the danger around her. She couldn't even see the babies she was protecting. But she could feel them. She could hear them. She could sense their need. And that was enough. Love doesn't need eyes. It just needs a willing heart and the courage to stand firm when the storm is raging. Grace lived to be 23 years old, an impressive age for any horse, especially one who'd survived what she had. When she finally passed, it was peacefully in her sleep, in the warm stall that had been her home for 18 years, with hope and faith standing guard outside her door. Thomas buried her on a hill, overlooking the pasture where she'd spent so many happy days, and he planted wildflowers over her grave that would bloom every spring. The marker he placed there was simple. Grace, it read. She couldn't see the storm, but she never stopped protecting what she loved. A mother, a miracle, a hero. This incredible story of grace, hope, and faith reminds us that the most powerful force in nature isn't the storm, it's the will to protect those we love. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that miracles can happen even in the coldest, darkest moments. Subscribe to our channel for more amazing horse stories that celebrate the unbreakable bond between these magnificent animals and the humans lucky enough to know them. And tell us in the comments what's the most incredible act of animal courage you've ever witnessed. We love hearing your stories. Until next time, remember that love always finds a way, even through the worst storms life can throw at us.